back to this special edition of the Electric Africa podcast, recorded live at the convening AI Artists and Immersive Futures in Johannesburg. I'm Ajwa Nkoma, Director of Policy and Research at Electric South. Over 3 days, we're gathering artists, technologists, researchers, and cultural thinkers to explore how AI and immersive media intersect with African creativity. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Meghna Singh, an artist, researcher, and affiliate of the MIT Open Doc Lab. Meghna's practice spans film, VR, AR, and research, and her work has consistently explored questions of migration, memory, and global power structures. Meghna, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So Meghna, your work has crossed film, VR, AR, research. Can you share a little about your journey?
So, journey to go far back. I did a bachelor's in political science in Delhi. I'm from India. And that time I remember thinking, why didn't I get into art school? But in hindsight, that was the best undergrad degree I could have got. And then I did a master's in filmmaking, video and film. And we actually learned on the Bolex camera. And it was kind of the time period where it was analog and digital. So I'm so glad I had both. And then somehow I ended up working in the art department in the film industry in India. And then I remember thinking to myself after 2 years, what am I doing in the art department? I'm a director. And so I got this big scholarship from India, and I went to Central St. Martin's and I did another master's, and that was in performance design and practice. And that kind of really pulled everything I'd done in the past together and kind of opened up my world a bit more. And I was very idealistic after my second master's, and I was like, I'm an artist. And I figured the way to kind of survive and not have to work as a waitress and focus on my art practice was through some of these incredible funded art residencies around the world. And I'd always been very keen to come to Southern Africa. And so luckily I got a residency at a space called the Great Moor Studios in Woodstock, which was very active back then. It still is, but not as much. And I ended up in Cape Town in 2011. And I think being in Cape Town for the first time was a bit of a shock. It just felt a bit dated with the kind of sort of more post-apartheid politics, but I also found these incredible thinkers and artists, some of them at UCT, UWC. And so when I finished the 4 months and went back to London, London seemed really dull and boring. And I ended up returning to do a PhD. And the PhD only for the sake of coming back to the country. The aim was just to further my art practice. It's always been video installations and sculpture. So I was telling one of the participants at the convening, Sarah, that I make film, but it's never been shown on a flat screen. It's something you walk around and you kind of feel and touch, and different sort of mediums to project onto. And so the PhD ended up being making a case for immersive environments within migration studies. My focus had been, being kind of new to Cape Town and South Africa myself, I was drawn to sort of pockets of communities who were immigrants, and then also obsessed somehow with the ocean and globalization and kind of movements of people across the oceans, and got permission to basically work inside the port of Cape Town, which took a year to get. But once I was there, then I focused on a group of Indian seafarers indefinitely arrested, and then what does that mean, and a group of illegal immigrants from Ghana taking shelter inside this completely rusted diamond mining vessel. And so, it just kind of became a very interesting research around human migrations, but in a kind of a different way, that I was trying to bring their stories into the public realm through these immersive environments, which was mostly video installation at sites like the Castle of Cape Town. And the third case study was based on the remains of a slave ship that were found off Clifton Beach. And that ended up becoming the project Container, because my partner and I, after our first daughter was born, ended up applying to New Dimensions Lab at Electric South. Everyone's talking about Electric South and the New Dimensions Lab. And we got in, and it was amazing, like with all these mentors. And so we fleshed out the project, and then Container became this virtual reality 180 experience, again set within an installation. And just to end, I've spoken a lot about my background. We ended up showing it in the different port cities of South Africa. But instead of just a project traveling to different spaces, we said, why don't we make a new project which basically responds to every port city and the idea of import and export of people and commodities. So every sort of like Cape Town, Durban, Saldanha Bay, Richards Bay, all these port cities in South Africa, we kind of looked at a moment in the history of that city and then did a site-specific performative installation, and then Container, the VR experience, became just a feature of that. So that's a bit about my background.
That's amazing. I love Container. It was one of the first VR works I ever saw.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I love that answer. That fits so well with my next question, which is that you have collaborated with Electric South. You've been our alumni, and also very generous with your time. From your perspective, what role does Electric South play in shaping this field of immersive, and right now as we're speaking, AI-driven storytelling?
I mean, to be honest, I think Electric South in Southern Africa or in the African continent has been a game changer for kind of introducing artists using immersive technologies. I mean, I think it's like a real landmark sort of moment in this industry, where there's a before Electric South and there's an after Electric South. And I think when Stephen and Ingrid sort of thought of this and started it, they came with so much experience. And Ingrid, like, having worked in New York and globally, like, was someone, people respected. And so she came with like all these kind of links and connections. And Stephen, having been this producer, came with his expertise. And I think what was really important from my sort of experience of Electric South and is these links and connections, because then you're not in isolation. It's not like we've started this space or this residency in Cape Town or Johannesburg and we're inviting artists and we're teaching them these tools. I think the really important part of it is like who's coming in with their expertise from North America, from Australia, and so like in a very short period of time, it's trying to fill in that gap in that sense. And I mean, like in terms of also the success of a lot of the projects, that's come out of the New Dimensions Lab, hosted by Electric South, has been amazing. So, suddenly you have some of the projects from South Africa, or like, Senegal and Ghana and the Electric South alumni showing like at the Sundance Film Festival, at Venice, at Tribeca, and it's just kind of put projects from the continent on the map of these like kind of, global North festivals where for whatever reason people's kind of yardstick for success in filmmaking and then these film festivals having these immersive sections is like, what festival have you shown at? And so I think Electric South's done that so successfully. Like I said, it's become really now this kind of establishment, and every time the open call comes out, like I have so many people who've been like documentary filmmakers working in fiction, saying that, I think it's time for me to branch out and start using VR or AR. I think it's kind of created this intrigue and interest in something which is not just, kind of more traditional filmmaking. And so I think what it's done is it's created this interest from people from so many different backgrounds. And I think that's also something it's done so successfully is to bring like practitioners who are architects like Mikhail, who are visual artists, who are working with sculpture, and then like documentary filmmakers So it's kind of like bringing in these sort of like people from different kind of working in different art forms and backgrounds, and then kind of like taking their interests and like helping them flesh out their projects. Um, and and for me, I mean, I guess, you know, after like having gone through this, and it's never easy, this sort of experience of like research and art practice, and you're like, how am I going to make money, and is this really my life? And then like, you know, there's something, there's an opportunity that comes, and so I always feel like, you know, there's a moment where I've reached a certain sort of stage in my life that it's time to give back, and just kind of like, you know, people helped me along the way a lot, like mentored me, like supported me, and I kind of always believe in like some sort of karmic cycle of like, if you can, like, you got to just make sure that I become one of those people like who is mentoring me, supporting me, and if you can do that for like, you know, people in their like early 20s, mid 20s, whatever, who are starting out, then that's great.
Yeah, from my experience with the New Dimensions Lab, that's exactly it, is that both Stephen and Ingrid have such an appreciation for the craft and allowing people to experiment with the craft. I think there's very few spaces where that is enabled. And then people experience that generosity and they're so willing to come back then as mentors, etc. Well, now shifting to our convening, another experimental space. What's been most exciting or surprising or challenging to you about the discussions over these few days?
I think firstly, I have to say it's amazing you've come on board. Like, really. I think, you know, like last year or till the year before last, or it's been this like New Dimensions Lab, and that's Electric South. And then it's been like, okay, there's sort of like funding from the British Council, and then there's a kind of a, you know, fashion and whatever, immersive technologies lab, or there's something else that comes in, and those are kind of like once off kind of, you know, open calls, and now I think like with you taking on this kind of AI convening, it's also become this kind of landmark. I think it's become this, yeah, there's a New Dimensions Lab, but there's also this AI convening, and I think that's so important because, you know, it's giving more people opportunities to tap into the resources Electric South has, you know, because there's only that many participants you can have at the New Dimensions Lab. So I think this has been great because it's almost like, okay, there's this thing happening as well. For me, the most exciting since yesterday, I think it's been amazing to, I don't know everyone. I knew a few people, and so it's been really nice to kind of be introduced to other people who are artists and researchers and kind of like, you know, interested in the same theme. So that's been really nice, and I kind of enjoyed today when we sort of broke out into two groups. I work more in that way, like of like, you know, smaller groups and coming up with ideas. I feel like everyone gets to have a say, and it's just more conversational, and you know, people can argue more. And so I enjoyed like when we called ourselves the artists and not the experts, and then we sat around and we kind of had an exchange around like what's needed now, and tools or engines or whatever. That was nice, and I've kind of enjoyed like obviously meeting the new people, but then you've had these 5-minute, 7-minute like flash presentations,
Lightning talks.
And I must admit I'm going to steal that idea because I'm kind of heading this Nordic AR in public space sort of network collective, and I think people don't really always like, okay, now I have to make a presentation. You know, it's a bit like, oh, do I have to prepare for that? But the idea of this lightning talk is amazing because you can just go up and talk, or like you can show a short video and no one's bored either, you know? So that's also been nice.
Well, I love the feedback. Okay, so in your view, you know, we've been experimenting, thinking about, hashing out what we are calling artist-centered policy development. What do you think that could look like in practice? What do you think is difficult about that? I know that Ingrid and I have had a lot of conversations about the artist activists and not burdening artists with that. So, yeah.
I think I don't know around policies. I mean, there've been works, and I've kind of researched a bit myself around artists who've been working towards decolonizing these tools of AI, especially like queer and female artists in the global south. And and I've been inspired by some of the work. So there's a young artist called Iggy Ayundun, and she's based in Brazil. I don't know if you know of their work. She had this photograph. It was AI generated on the cover of Vogue Brazil, and it got a lot of attention. But I remember like looking into her background story, and she was born to parents who were dancers and samba dancers, and I think she was terminally ill when she was very little, and all her mother could do, because she came from a certain religion, paint her blue and offer to the god, that like, can you save my child? And she's like, I'm 24 now, and I'm still alive, so of course I was saved. But she's also an art director, and so she would like direct photo shoots for fashion magazines. So when she was, now this is 4 years ago, when she was creating these images, and the title, I remember like being kind of really touched by the title. It was called something around images I've never seen before, or something. These are images I've never seen before. And so she was kind of creating these images of like Afro-Brazilian people, like really beautiful, just the kind you would see in like a fashion magazine. But all these people were painted blue. And you really like couldn't tell, unlike the uncanny valley images that you see, if these were like models who'd been photographed, or like you wouldn't think they're AI generated. But I just remember thinking that, like in terms of like, we were having this discussion earlier, and people were like, I think we shouldn't be kind of sort of downward looking in terms of like, this is bad about our AI, and we have to restrict this, and ethics. And it's what I enjoyed from yesterday, and the two artists who spoke about like what it's opened up for them and the potential, especially coming from a background where they said we didn't know how to sell our work or write, but like now someone can write. So I'm just thinking of Iggy, like, who creates these beautiful images, AI generation, and has one of her photographs on the cover of the Vogue magazine, and it's become increasingly famous. And so, like, in terms of policies, I mean, I'm concerned, with artists. I think people using tools to aid in the construction of work. I don't see artists just relying on AI. I think it's a conversation, and I think instead of working in isolation, because being a creative artist or being a researcher, these are kind of like lonely sort of experiences in which you think a lot, and you want to, because it's your creative practice. But here's something you can just sort of like go back and forth with, and like some ideas are crap, and you won't take them on board. But it's just like, if it suggests like one thing which sort of sparks something in my head, and I like, make sure that it's correct, then that can just kind of lead me onto something else. And so I personally do enjoy this kind of like interaction in sometimes what's possible. And I would never give it like the creative authorship and say this is kind of like, when people say AI generated, like, yes it is, but like it didn't just do it itself. Are you taking away from my sort of experience and knowledge in creating this? The policies which I am really concerned about, and I think there should be something done where the government needs to come into play, is around representation and the use of like images and videos of minors, anyone below the age of 18, because I think, and they've been like, films and documentaries, and there was one really scary one based on the story of this young, like 12-year-old boy in the UK, who he just won Emmy Award for the best actor. He's only 13, but it's these kind of online groups. I mean,
Yes.
I can't remember the name, but so my nervousness around the use of AI is like I said, as artists, we use it because we want to kind of interact with it. We want to just sort of like let AI like kind of throw something that might spark an interest. We kind of are mature enough to see what the interaction is and how much it comes into our lives and how much it kind of dictates how we think and feel, but not like people who are 12 and 13 and 14 and like things like voice cloning, or like image cloning, and everyone's on Instagram, and so like what happens when like teenagers or even people younger are kind of like sort of encounter sort of AI being used in the wrong way. So in terms of a policy, and I know it's veering away from what you really asked around like artists and AI policy, just as someone who's socially conscious and has children, I'm just like, now the government needs to step in and kind of like, have some very strict laws around like, if you're going to use my child's face or body or like, like what does that mean? I think in Denmark a few months ago they've actually come up with this law that like your body is your property, and if anyone's going to use that, you can sue them for that. I think if there has to be a policing or there has to be policies, like I'm like, okay, what around like minors, yes, in terms of like in a practical way, I think there should be something around, like I remember when we were working on the Founders Pillars and we were using Sora to generate video images, and spent so much time because like every prompt you give, it like creates an image, especially of like African people. You're like, no, that's not what I want to use. So I remember Simon was working on creating this image, and like after 3 days he got few seconds of something quite beautiful and hold on to that, and then kind of feed that in and ask it to expand that, and then he had this beautiful image. But then the next day he was like, oh look, Meghna, they've used our image on Sora as like one of the images that's been created.
Oh, wow.
And so I got a bit pissed off. I was like, but you spent 3-4 days just generating that one image. And he was like, yeah, it's fine. But I'm like, now that's not fine, because if someone is using AI, but then like I said, it's my experience, it's my prompting, and how I'm creating those prompts is not like out of the blue, right? And if I create something now, does anyone have the right to use that and start afresh? Because they can use that image and start creating something. So I think this idea of like at some point there has to be authorship and questions around authorship. Like in the beginning you're playing around, but like, and so even with the Founders Pillars, there are 6 textile films, and we use Sora, but it was a lot of like taking bits and feeding it in and then having these 90 seconds. But now these 90 seconds, the project is ours, but what do we mean by ours? We've shown it at MIT, we've shown it at Tribeca, and it's an AR experience. But if someone was to take those 90 seconds of films, or like it had been featured on the homepage as an example of this is quite beautiful, and take that and make it, then where's our authorship in that? So I think in terms of policies, like at some point, and you don't have to own it. I don't know about like owning, like that always feels like there's a monetary association, but how do you keep that, and like the platform doesn't use it to publicize or show that this has been generated using Sora.
There's lots of issues around consent that seem undecided in this moment, even in the prompting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess looking forward, what kind of projects do you think could make a difference for African creative artists as AI accelerates? What do you feel is missing?
I mean, there was a question around archives, and I know it was quite a lively discussion, because Sarah, who's a filmmaker, was saying that, there's certain archives that are missing, and, I can use AI to create the archives. And then Mikhail spoke in his presentation about synthetic archives, and I was like, but if it's synthetic, it's not an archive, it's just a fiction film. But having said that, we ourselves responded to these 6 fabrics, which were scanned and sourced, and then they're these sort of like indigenous knowledge or knowledges associated with those textiles from these 6 different regions in the African continent. So Lasiba, who's our collaborator, we asked him, like, what is the myth around it? And he was like, oh, like an ancient myth is they think a mermaid rose from the bottom of the ocean and spread these symbols everywhere. And we're like, okay, fine. But, like, that's a kind of knowledge. And so we do want to acknowledge that, and we do want to respect that. So why don't we take that as a prompt and then create the visual? And so I think this idea on like the missing, you can say, archive or kind of missing beautiful moments which were not documented, or missing kind of respect to sort of indigenous knowledges which might be going around villages around a certain fabric. Like, I think with AI one can fill in that gap to sort of create visual imagery which respects these folklores, and that's possible now, and kind of respect those. And so I think it's with the archive also, like, I think there was a film, Field of Vision produced it. I can't remember the artist's name, but her entire film was about Black Americans, and how there's an archive missing of joy and beauty in their lives. So she kind of, and she didn't use AI. This was like 6-7 years ago. It's just normal actors, being filmed, and it was in black and white. And I was like, okay, that's quite beautiful to play on the idea of, like, what's missing, and but to clearly say it's not an archive, it's generated. I always feel like with AI that disclaimer is very important, because a lot of people who don't know about this, like, you showed it to my grandmother, she'll believe it's real, and that's the kind of problem with it as well. So I think a disclaimer just to say it's AI generated, and increasingly more and more it's going to become so common, but still I think that's important. But to answer your question, I mean, my personal viewpoint at this point is that I think within the continent there's scope to bring certain stories alive which we never saw captured in video, or we don't see photographs of, but we've just heard stories. So, like, let's use those, like, myths and folk tales and kind of oral stories, and give them a visual form.
Or even perhaps AI needs its own terminology, because something like a synthetic archive confuses what an archive is. And now we're in that entire field. But I guess that's all we have time for. Thank you, Meghna, for sharing your reflections and for being such an important voice in this space. This episode is part of our special Electric Africa podcast series, recorded live at the convening AI Artists and Immersive Features. Follow our work at electricsouth.org and on our YouTube and social media. I'm Ajwa Nkoma. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Thank you.